Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in our discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe during the pandemic. IFES is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that assists electoral processes, broadly defined, across the world. And we have supported elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 14th installment in our series, and so far we are focused on issues ranging from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, and abuse of state resources. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance, with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices, and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. So last month, we talked about the internal political process in Russia. Well, this time we will focus on the influence of Kremlin over politics in other European countries. The government of the Russian Federation uses various approaches to destabilize democratic governments across Europe and to encourage the rise of populist and anti-democratic regimes. In face of this, what can be done to assist countries to mitigate threats, to deliver credible and democratic elections, and support inclusion in equality in the often messy and chaotic process of democracy? So to learn more about this topic, we have with us prominent experts on electoral and political processes. First, I will turn to the IFES Program Manager for Europe and Eurasia, Daria Azariev North. We will discuss with David Levine, who's an Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the German Marshall Fund. We will turn to Olga Lautman, who is a researcher and analyst of Russian foreign influence. And we will continue with Nika Aleksejeva, who's a lead researcher for the Baltics at the Digital Forensic Research Lab of the Atlantic Council. And finally, we will discuss with Professor Eduard Melnikau at the Academic Department of Social Sciences at the European Humanities University in Lithuania. And we will talk in particular about the influence of the Russian government over politics and the information landscape in Belarus. We'll then open for questions and for a discussion. If you have any questions to our panelists, you can already now type those in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So first, I want to turn to Daria Azariev North from IFES. Daria, what influence does Kremlin have in European countries, and how does this impact the democratic process? Indeed, what forms does the influence by the Russian government take?
Thanks very much, Magnus. Russian malign influence in Europe's political order is by no means a new phenomenon. However, its methods continue to adapt and expand, and with it, so does the risk that it poses to electoral integrity and credible democratic processes in the region. This so-called Kremlin playbook is used to destabilize and discredit democratic institutions such as election management bodies, branches of government, media, and universities across Europe and Eurasia. And all of this is in an effort to weaken public trust in the democratic process. Although much of this is still being accomplished through an arsenal of classic tools such as propaganda, economic pressures, support for nationalist and separatist movements, as well as outright military interventions. In recent years, it's really become a multi-pronged approach, which includes hybrid warfare tactics, such as complex disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks. And so all of these approaches are designed to take advantage of existing vulnerabilities and cleavages within societies and democracies, ultimately with the goal of manipulating the public and breeding cynicism to in democracy, essentially to such a degree that it will lead to backsliding or simply render change unimaginable. All that to say, the Russian influence strategy is multifaceted. And while there is no single remedy to counter these threats, a recommitment to democratic principles, coupled with equipping democratic institutions with the skills they need to face these threats, is crucial.
Daria, you said this is not a new phenomenon. So why should we care now?
Yes, well, while it's certainly not a new phenomenon, the Kremlin's tactics keep accelerating and expanding, which means that so do the threats and the risk that they pose to both aspiring and established democracies. We are seeing this toolkit expansion through the various foreign influence attacks that the Kremlin has undertaken in recent years, whether it's interference in elections or the multiple cybersecurity attacks that we've witnessed both in the US and across Europe. Most recently, we're seeing this manifest acutely in Belarus through the shifting approach in the information space and the way in which propaganda, disinformation, and censorship have migrated from radio and state TV channels to social media platforms. And this is really all in an effort to undermine ongoing protests and the growing civic awareness in the country. We're also seeing how the targets of Kremlin influence are shifting and multiplying beyond the standard sphere of Russian influence. So many countries in Europe with vastly varying democratic trajectories are encountering these challenges, whether those are countries from the previous Soviet bloc, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, countries that transitioned to democracy in the early 90s, like the Baltic states, or even established democracies in Central Europe. And then the pandemic has also further shown us how foreign influence and disinformation can undermine the credibility of electoral processes and public institutions. And so it's really underscored the importance of election management bodies and other democratic institutions being equipped and responding effectively to such crises. Each country in Europe has its own distinct vulnerabilities as well as reactions to interference. And so it is difficult to generalize about Europe as a whole, and it's really important that we are tailoring these responses and strategies accordingly.
Final question, Daria. What is IFES doing to help European countries to respond to these threats and challenges to democracy?
So at IFES, we try to approach the challenge of countering Kremlin influence from a holistic perspective. And we believe that the best solution is to build the resilience of democratic institutions in confronting this threat. We are working towards this by building our electoral stakeholders' capacity in 4 pillar areas. The first of which, unsurprisingly, is cybersecurity, which we do by offering tailored training curriculums to election management bodies and civil society organizations to strengthen their cyber hygiene practices and equip them with the skills they need to prevent and respond to a cyber attack effectively. And then corruption is another key entry point for Kremlin malign influence in the region. And so IFES is supporting efforts to increase transparency in campaign spending in a way that will assist in bringing attention to foreign funds being used both by national actors as well as actors outside the country. And then disinformation is, of course, another core pillar as it continues to grow into one of the greatest threats to democracy. So to help electoral stakeholders respond to this threat, IFES recently established a working group for election management bodies dedicated to disinformation, social media, and electoral integrity. And this working group is meant to serve as a forum for peer exchange, knowledge building, and also identifying their needs and what tools they may need. And so one of these tools that we've recently developed is a crisis communications and combating disinformation playbook in partnership with the Brunswick Group to help support EMB's preparedness on this front. We're also working with election management bodies in the social media sphere to help them become more effective communicators in the digital space, since this is, of course, where much of malign disinformation spreads. And then finally, to better counter such foreign influence attacks and tactics, citizens need to be able to first properly identify and understand them. And so at IFES, we support this through a wide range of civic education and media literacy initiatives, including our Seed Civic Education University course, which is now offered at more than 70 universities across Georgia, Armenia, and Ukraine. And this course is designed to foster conscious citizenship in the digital age by cultivating young people's mindful consumption of information through media literacy and critical thinking skills, among other things. Media literacy is a vital tool for equipping young people with the ability to discern propaganda and disinformation narratives. But also civic education more broadly is indispensable for inspiring and empowering young people to believe that change is possible, change is important, and that their voice matters. Without it, people can become disenfranchised from the political process, and that's really when cracks open up to autocracy and foreign influence.
Thank you very much, Daria Azariev from IFES. Next, we turn to David Levine from the Alliance for Securing Democracy. So David, well, whether or not it's true, there is a perception within the Russian government that there are Western efforts to effect regime change. And as a result, Russia is heavily focused on defending its territory and its regime, which includes being seen as a great power whose position in the world is unassailable. In that vein, what is the motivation for Kremlin to try to influence other countries, including many in Europe?
Magnus, no, it's a great question. And again, I appreciate you having me alongside these other sort of esteemed panelists. I think, just to be really clear and to build on what Daria said, I think it's really important as we're sort of thinking about Kremlin intervention in European countries that we're mindful of a few things. Number one, the best defense is a good offense. And undoubtedly, right, Russia feels, the Kremlin feels, that in order to make up for some of its vulnerabilities at home, some of which were identified in that last webinar you talked about, and its inability, right, to adequately take care of its own people, right? Part of what it needs to do is to cause mayhem with those it perceives as adversaries or threats, including the countries we're going to discuss today. So I think that thing is, I think, number one. I think in that vein, it's important to note too that it is mindful that by doing this and engaging in this behavior, that it can shift the conversation away from its own foibles, and it also keeps an eye on those who maybe are aspiring democracies. This is a really critical moment. The Alliance for Securing Democracy that I work at came into effect in 2017 precisely because of Russian interference, in this case in the US 2016 election, and many of those tools, of course, that were used in that election have been used in many other European countries' elections. And so there are other countries that are watching and thinking about whether democracy may be the best form of government for them, and are looking closely at, among other things, what the Kremlin is doing. And I think the other thing, of course, that's really important, is that if you perceive a threat, to you, regardless of whether it's true, then one of the best things to do is to try and keep those countries' attention off of you. And so in that vein, if in fact, you are trying to sow chaos and confusion and polarize people, you by doing that can focus countries or get countries to be focusing more inwardly, potentially on domestic issues at home, or maybe intrusions into their elections, as opposed to focusing outwardly on other potential issues. For example, the threats to democracy from authoritarian actors.
Okay, David. So far we've been talking quite generally about Russian influence. Let's focus in on individual cases. Let's look at a few countries. For example, why does the Russian government try to influence the democratic process in the United Kingdom?
Sure. So, I think obviously in July of 2020, the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, released a long-awaited sort of Russia report, a 9-month delayed, I think it was a 55-page assessment of Russia's malign interference, right, in UK democratic processes. And I think there are a few things that are worth noting. You know, why the UK? Well, I think there is a perception, which is largely true, that, you know, after potentially the United States and NATO, that the UK is seen as, right, one of the sort of, you know, principal threats to Russia. You know, obviously the Salisbury incident happened, right, some time ago, and there was, right, retribution from the UK government, for example, there. I think another thing that's worth noting, though, which is really important in that report, is number one, right, the UK acknowledged that there was no effort made to see whether or not really, right, Russia had interfered in the Brexit vote, which I think is worth noting, because I think a country like Russia will take that information and run with it. I think the other thing that's worth noting as well, which I think is also important, is that, you know, you see from that report that Great Britain, right, welcomed, right, to put it in the report's own words, Russian oligarchs and Russian influence. And frankly, you know, if there's a country that you perceive that's a threat to you, and that country is, right, has vulnerabilities, is it providing ready access to sort of agents of your government in many cases, then why not, right, try and inculcate yourself, right, into the UK's sort of democratic processes and try and gain influence. And I would go even further. I think it's not just about gaining influence, to be really clear. I think it's actually engaging in subversion. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important to note about Russian influence is that it's more than just sort of soft diplomacy, right? It's not as much as, you know, Russia does not have the military might that it once did, but it recognizes, and Daria talked about this, that some of the tools it's using, some of the subversive tools, whether it's around economic coercion, information manipulation, cyber attacks, right? These kinds of acts it can carry out, and it can carry out with relatively little consequence. And of course, right, the UK is one example of that.
Okay, but this is really interesting. So let's continue. Let's take France. Why is Russia trying to influence the French democratic process?
Well, you know, so I think a couple of things are worth noting. Obviously, when you know, Russia interfered, right, in France's, you know, 2017 presidential election, at that point, and still may be, right, potentially the biggest episode, right, of election interference in a European country. Others can take issue with me on that. Certainly, it's one of the biggest. And I think, you know, I think it's worth noting that when we look at the EU, that we'll talk about Germany in a moment as well, that France and Germany are two of the biggest engines in the European Union. And I think in addition to that, and I think it's worth noting that in a number of ways, right, France successfully, you know, countered, right, lots of efforts to interfere, right, in France's 2017 presidential election, but that it was in some respects like closer than it might have originally been thought. I mean, I think, right, not only was this a major test for the transatlantic democratic community following the 2016 presidential election in America, right, but it was between two candidates that offered a stark choice. Obviously, the president now, Emmanuel Macron, but on the other hand, right, the other person that Macron was running against, of course, was Marine Le Pen, who ran on an anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti-immigrant, pro-Russia platform. And not only that, but of course, Le Pen and her party had deep ties to Russia. And when that party was in financial trouble, it was an obscure bank, right, that came to its rescue. And so, you know, I think one of the things that Russia does, the Kremlin does and does well, I think, is not only look at where it has successfully, right, interfered in some respects, right, whether it's in the United States in 2016 or maybe, right, in the UK when we think about, you know, Brexit in some respects, but even those places where it's not entirely successful, right, where it made significant inroads, because you don't need a successful operation in order to have harmful consequences. And so, you know, ASD is going to be doing a project, and obviously others are going to be doing projects looking toward French presidential elections in 2022. And I fully expect the Kremlin to seek to try and intervene in those elections as well.
You mentioned Germany. Let's consider Germany. What would be the motivation of the Russian government to try to interfere with the German democratic process, including the elections that are being held this year?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, I think it's worth noting, of course, that Germany may be the biggest, of course, economic engine in the EU. And of course, they had these federal elections this past September, right, that marked a critical change not only for Germany, but for Europe as well, right? You had a leader in Chancellor Merkel who had led Europe's largest country and economic powerhouse since 2005, right? Of course, long before the specter of financial, migration, and coronavirus crises. And of course, we all know she's soon going to be retiring. And so I think with that race for Chancellor Open, the future direction of Germany, right, was up in the air. And so not only was this election important for the German people, right, but of course, it was an alluring target for foreign and domestic actors seeking to influence elections and undermine democratic processes. And so, you know, ASD, of course, had a German election dashboard. Others, of course, monitored the election. What they found was that Russian actors tried to sow doubts about the legitimacy of the election by, of course, highlighting alleged irregularities in the election, right? And you know, in an effort to try and undermine folks' sort of confidence in German democracy. And we saw that in any number of ways. We saw them, you know, falsely state that the OSCE was sending considerably fewer German election observers, right, this year, which suggested a higher susceptibility to election fraud or irregularities due to this change. And of course, you know, one of the reasons why, of course, Germany is in many cases was better to rebut some of this is because it's got entities like Corrective that were able to push back and say, no, in fact, the OSCE election expert team was bigger than Germany's, right, than the OSCE team that came in 2017, right? And so I think one of the things that I think is, you know, really important to note is that we saw, right, a real opportunity both for domestic and foreign policy reasons, and we saw that Russia try and take advantage of that. And so I think it's really important to sort of take away from these things broadly, right, the sense that, you know, Russia goes after actors that it perceives as threats. And one of those threats, of course, is democracy. And of course, the three countries I mentioned are three countries that are established democracies, but in spite of the fact that they're established democracies, they're of course going through their own, right, challenges at home. And you know, one of the things that Russia, of course, has a long history of is trying to exploit those challenges in an effort to facilitate, right, and promote its own aims.
Well, thanks for this overview, David. Final question, and briefly, what lessons can we then learn from these experiences in the efforts to counter Russian interference?
I think there are a couple of things that we learned from this experience. On the one hand, I think, as Daria and you have noted, it's worth noting, right, whether we're talking about, right, AFD in Germany, the National Front in France, right, or, you know, of course, what happened sort of in Brexit, that there are horses that Russia sometimes chooses to sort of, right, to sort of align itself with, but that Russia's game is not necessarily about picking a political party and running with them. Right, the larger goal is sowing chaos and confusion and trying to undermine democracy. And it doesn't, frankly, care what it needs to do to sort of effectuate that goal. It will sort of do whatever it needs to sort of do that. And so it's really important, right, in these countries and elsewhere that there is a unified, right, nonpartisan approach to the, you know, to the threat of foreign interference, right? Number one. I think, you know, number two that I think is really important as well is that, you know, some people may think that, okay, the preferred candidate in a given election, you know, that maybe Russia supported didn't win in an election and therefore Russia's interference wasn't successful. And anyone who has that view, I would encourage them to take a breath, right? Because I think part of what we've seen, whether it's in the United States, whether it's with Brexit, whether it's with France, right, is that a harmful interference operation doesn't necessarily have to result in a preferred candidate. And so I think, you know, one of the things that's really important is we need countries, right, working together, right, to share lessons learned from their elections, both in terms of what worked and what hasn't, so that we can keep up with the evolving capabilities, right, that adversaries like Russia present.
Thank you very much, David Levine from the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We continue with Olga Lautman, researcher and analyst of Russian foreign influence. Olga, let me ask you, what tactics does the Russian government use to gain influence in European countries for the purpose of increasing its influence and to create division?
First, Magnus, thank you so much for having me on this discussion, so important. And To add to what David was just saying, Russia really has two main goals. One is to weaken all the post-World War II alliances, and two is to replace US, as the superpower because of the humiliation they felt post-Soviet Union collapse. And now to this question, Russia uses many tactics to gain influence, but I want to focus on a few. One is economic capture and the other political capture. And we're seeing it play out right now across Europe with the energy crisis that Russia has created. So what they do is they seek to gain a foothold in industries that are crucial to countries. And then they use that, they want to create reliance by those countries on Russia. And then they use that as a means of leverage to kind of control the actions of the country and the political leaders of those countries. So basically, and they're doing all of this to achieve, their goals, which for the most part are nefarious, and again, goes back to weakening alliances. So as far as I was saying, we're seeing this play out right now with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They used their very close relationship with the former Chancellor of Germany, Schroeder, who was sitting on the board of Gazprom, to initiate this pipeline deal. And as a result, they, now there are issues with certifying the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They're using holding back gas as blackmail in order to have this certification completed, which in return, right before winter, is raising prices to astronomical levels. And we're also seeing this in Moldova. There was a report that came out that, Russia ended their supply to Moldova and offered them, Gazprom offered them a new deal if they were to weaken their ties with EU. So, I mean, we keep seeing the same thing happening over and over. And as far as political capture, I mean, we see, for instance, someone had mentioned, the poisoning of the Skripals and the British response. We see Russia's Kremlin-aligned leaders like Hungary's Öhman or the former Chancellor of Austria, Kurz, who would put roadblocks in a normal response, whether it's to assassination attempts on European soil, whether it's to cyber attacks, the election interferences. And I mean, that becomes a very big issue.
Magnus, you are muted.
The concept of hybrid warfare is mentioned in this context. What is that? And what hybrid warfare tools is the Russian government using in relation to European countries?
Well, hybrid warfare is basically using all tactics that fall below the threshold of conventional war. So basically, it's cyber attacks, it's political capture, it's economic capture, it's disinformation campaigns, it's seeking and amplifying divisions inside of countries, and again, weakening alliances, as well as interference in elections, which we see in Europe and US.
Okay, so if we, as an illustration, look at elections, what tactics does the Russian government use to interfere with the electoral process in European countries?
Well, the first thing that they normally do is they, again, seek divisions inside the country existing. They don't create, a lot of times they don't create the divisions. They seek the divisions and then they amplify them. And we saw that before German elections, a few years ago when, they were using migrants as a divisive, as a divisive topic. We see this in US with migrants. We see this with the pandemic right now, vaccine, anti-vaccine, and all the protests that are happening across Europe. So that's their number one thing, is to seek and amplify divisions to get people inside the country fighting. Then they use these divisions to start their disinformation campaigns. And we see these disinformation campaigns, amplified to a level and seen by everybody. My child on, TikTok was repeating Kremlin disinformation during our US 2020 election. So this is targeting everyone, Facebook, every single social media platform, every single media outlet. And then of course we see cyber attacks, we see, engaging in mass disinformation campaigns against candidates. And we saw that again in the 2016 US elections, where their chosen candidate was Trump. And the attacks that they, put on Hillary Clinton were endless. And we see the same thing happening in Europe. They usually find their chosen candidate, but again, it doesn't mean they offer their full support. Their main thing is to sow chaos. And then they just, create a big chaotic scene to a point. Their main goal is that they put so much disinformation that people kind of give up. They're like, I don't know what part of this is real, what is not true. And they kind of, check out of it, or they fall into the camp where they just freely, continue spreading this disinformation.
Olga, something that I've always found interesting is it seems that a lot of efforts by the Russian government includes propping up far-right political forces. Why? Is that for ideological reasons?
No. Putin has no ideology besides, sowing chaos and collapsing democracies around the world. For the most part, they are aligned with the far right. They prop up, they finance, provide logistics in spreading their disinformation to the far right, because the far right is normally seen as anti-democratic. But at the same time, we also see them supporting the far left. So their main thing is to marginalize the center, which is the majority of the people. So all we hear is, chaos through the far right parties, chaos through far left parties, and they use them for different means. For the most part, we see the far right being used, but recently there was an example in US after the Pandora Papers came out, where, Kremlin, the oligarchs who were in the Pandora Papers, one of them said, oh, this, Pandora Papers is a CIA operation. We saw this disinformation travel from his mouth, and it flowed right into the far left. So we didn't hear anything on the far right. So they use the two different, groups, depending on what information they want to push out.
Okay, but Olga, I'll end with the same question that I asked David. Basically, what can Western actors do to mitigate the influence of the Russian government?
Well, the most important, I think, because, for instance, in Ukraine, they were used as a testing ground for all of this. Everything that the Kremlin has unleashed on the West was done in Ukraine and all of Russia's neighbors. So the first thing is to actually learn from Russia's neighbors who have gone through this. Like in US, we're seeing, the solar winds, cyber attacks that are, the fallout continuing by Russian intelligence agencies. Whereas we had in Estonia, one of the biggest cyber attacks, and then in Ukraine that took out their power. So the first thing I would say is to take the lessons from Eastern European countries who have been warning us forever on, what to do. The second thing, we need a clear policy with Russia. We need to understand the threat they pose, and we need to make sure that as a united bloc, any country who values and cherishes, the ideals of democracy, that we are united on that front. And then together, because I mean, right now with social media, disinformation is spread. It goes from, St. Petersburg show factory, it'll flow to US in a matter of seconds through Europe. We need to have a strategy, a containment strategy between Europe and US, where we identify these threats and create, solutions to them, which is cutting off the disinformation. Because I mean, David had said, not even if their candidate loses, it doesn't mean they're unsuccessful. Their candidate, Trump in US, lost. Meanwhile, we are now in almost November and still seeing the fallout from the disinformation that Russia is heavily involved in, along with Trump and his cronies. So we need definitely to do that and basically start addressing it. We have to cut the source of funds off, because a lot of times this money flows, through real estate, through our Western institutions, and that same money is used to conduct operations inside the countries. So we need, a good set of anti-corruption measures to be, put into place to stop the money flow. And we also need to make sure to, again, with a normal, clear foreign policy, to prevent our lawyers, our systems, our, accountants, our courts being used as a means of attacking us from within.
Thank you very much, Olga Lautman, researcher and analyst of Russian foreign influence. And we'll now discuss these issues together with Nika Aleksejeva from the Atlantic Council. Nika, my first question is about attribution. I'm sure that a lot of our participants, like me, are wondering, how do we know if an operation is Russian state-backed or not?
Thank you, Magnus. Yeah, so first of all, DFRLab doesn't do very broad researches in very broad questions. We are diving in very specific case studies that we see are happening or are worth to mention. Therefore, attribution is the key for us. And we are working using open source research methodology, which means that we are operating on public domain, and we take that evidence that we can find online and that is publicly available. So oftentimes there is no public disclosure about who is behind particular case. We can take a case of new network of fake Facebook accounts discovered that are sharing anti-vax messages. How do we know that it's Russia? We never know who is behind it unless someone really takes the responsibility. And that could be the limitation of our method. Because of course, if you collect enough evidence, but there is no one who takes responsibility for that case to happen in the first place, then the best we can do is to name it as pro-Russian narratives. For instance, this group of false Facebook networks, they were spreading they were spreading pro-Kremlin narratives because it's what Kremlin would profit from. So this is as far as we can go, unless, of course, as with the case of lifestyle pages that later turned out to be Sputnik's network of lifestyle pages. There were particular attributions in some cases to that network, and it was later corroborated by evidence collected by Facebook itself. So then we knew that it was Sputnik who created over 300 lifestyle pages to lure people into consuming their content through very innocent topics like recipes, traveling, and that kind of things. So yeah, and another crucial moment about attribution is that we tend to attribute Russia to whatever it can benefit from, and it's usually the first suspect, and it creates this glorified image of Russia being everywhere, capable of everything, and it creates this very mysterious, powerful kind of adversary that Russia in most cases proves that it's not. We can see the evidence of Navalny's poisoning or Skripal poisoning that the special agents that carried out these operations actually made many mistakes that left tracks for them later to be discovered by collectives as Bellingcat. And all this information was left for public domain, or someone could just buy it online. Russian special operations are not as strong of course, they are dangerous, and their main objective is to sow chaos. And as probably David mentioned, the end goal is not to have successful operation. The end goal is to disrupt.
Well, thank you very much. In this discussion series, we've often addressed the issue of social media. So in your view, what is the role of social media platforms in securing election integrity?
Indeed, social media platforms are the key amplifier of messages. And that's the main difference and the main reason why we are here, why we are discussing election interference in the first place. Because before, of course, Russia could finance some particular journalists, authors who would publish on media outlets, and social media wasn't the main tool of communication. But now it has evolved, and it's shaping the way we see the world. The information bubbles it creates is really influencing how we perceive things. And it has very low entry-level costs. Basically, it's very easy to create anonymous account by anyone, and no one knows that you're a dog on the internet. No one knows that you are a Russian spy on the internet. And technology also used to allow to bulk create such accounts. Like on Twitter, you can run quite simple code to generate hundreds or thousands of anonymous accounts that would later execute very simple, again, like robotized actions as retweeting or spamming a hashtag, get on the discovery part of Twitter, the trending section, and will sometimes disrupt or basically turn someone's attention to an ongoing discussion that is then taken over by more human controlled anonymous operators that may or may not be, basically working for the Kremlin. So social media, they create the platform, they create means for adversaries to abuse them. And unfortunately, they are quite slow in addressing the strategies that we already observed carried out on these platforms. Social media has already made some steps. For instance, Facebook introduced the ad library, which no one knew who is paying for advertisement before, but now you can go to ad library and see who is promoting what kind of ads. Also, in order to spread political messages, you need to verify your identity. So you can't pretend to be far left party if you are someone operating from Russia. You need to have some like real legal entity. So there's few levels of transparency and accountability introduced, but it's not enough. Still, you can create anonymous Facebook account, you can create anonymous Twitter account, and you can use automated means to spread your message. And sometimes, even if it's not technologically enabled, you can find people who for little money enough can do it for you. And it's still cheaper than basically, I don't know, buying off the whole parliament or something.
Thank you very much. Final question for you. We've spoken about various areas relating to foreign influence, but you're the lead researcher for the Baltics. So how do these issues pertain to the Baltic states?
Sure. Well, ever since we regained independence in 1991, there was Russian influence. And of course, we can't avoid it because we are close neighbors. There are many issues that we need to basically solve because we share the same border. And if at the beginning Russia took also a very democratic way, it kind of gave us handicap to well, to develop our government, to establish democratic processes that later were harder to disrupt. If Russia was turning into an autocratic regime as it's now, from the very beginning, probably it would be very hard for us to resist and to have resilience mechanisms in place. Also, there is very strong nationalism feeling nurtured by various cultural events, various kind of special celebrations, and there were many policies taken to strengthen the Latvian identity and probably go away from this post-Soviet and Russian type identity. Lately, there are also TV channels refused their licenses. I mean, Russian TV channels refused their licenses to avoid the content that Russia produces to be consumed by Russian speakers in Latvia. We can also talk about policies that Estonia and Lithuania made. Well, Lithuania is different because there is much smaller number of native Russian speakers, but Estonia and Latvia are quite similar in that regard. So yeah, education system helped. Also, the nurtured nationalism in a way helped to resist some malign narratives, but it doesn't solve the main problem that we also have divisions in our society. And as Olga rightly pointed out, Russia can easily poke into those divisions and sow chaos. So even though we are quite resilient to what we've seen before, we still are not prepared to what kind of comes from within. And for instance, vaccine hesitancy is quite a big issue in all the Baltic states. And unfortunately, these are internal actors who are profiting, and we don't have any mean to attribute them to any external actor yet. Nevertheless, it's there. And of course, Kremlin can profit from the anti-vax sentiment that is dividing the society at this point.
Thank you very much, Nika Aleksejeva from the Atlantic Council. We will now turn to Professor Eduard Melnikau at the European Humanities University, and we will talk about the influence of Kremlin in one particular country, which is Belarus. Please note that Professor Melnikau will be talking in Russian. This means that if you've been listening to this discussion so far without interpretation, please make sure that you go to the bottom of your screen and select English. Otherwise, you won't hear anything. Professor Melnikau, my first question to you is, how wide is the information presence of the Russian government in the media sphere of Belarus?
It is no doubt that the Russian information influence in Belarus has a long history, including the time period when Belarus was one of the republics of the former Soviet Union. Now, according to the statements of representatives of the Lukashenko government, Russian content takes at least 65% of the media space in Belarus. Among the printed publications, printed media, the share of the Russian content is no less than 30%. Among the 23 online radio channels, 19 are Russian. In prime time of the leading channels required for inclusion in the package of cable TV operators, the share of the Russian content ranges from 49 to 67% of airtime. On some TV channels, it reaches the level of 70%. RTR Belarus, we have such specificity of some of the TV channel that they can share both content produced produced in Russia as well as in Belarus. According to research agencies such as Genius Audience, a quarter of Belarusian citizens do not use Belarusian websites at all, while a third of Belarusian citizens learn the latest news using the Russian media. This situation is largely due to the fact that part of the Belarusian audience gets to news sites not directly but through aggregators of large internet corporations, Google, Microsoft, and Russian Yandex and Mail.ru. That is the brief review of the present day situation.
Well,
and also it has to be noted that there is a discrimination against the Belarusian media on the side of global news agencies such as Google or Yandex. That is concerning quantitative indicators, but in terms of content, that is important to mention. The main messages of the Russian propaganda are targeting Belarusian audience, founding on such well-known stereotypes, such as Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are branches of the same people, the Great Russian. There is no alternative to the merger of Russia and Belarus. Nobody needs us in the West. Belarus is an outpost of Russia in the West. EU is undergoing through the decay. US is a threat to peace. And such messages get skillfully dissolved in the bulk of television and internet media products. The predominant content of TV series being mass culture, they are rooted in post-Soviet stereotypes, such as strong law enforcement services, preference to the public values, societal things and values, not personal things and values. And as a result, the Russian media created such a peculiar picture in the minds of the population of Belarus, where chauvinistic Russian stereotypes dominate and the cult of violence.
Well, Professor Melnikau, thank you very much for that. One question for you. There have been mentions in the debate of sometimes called a hybrid aggression in Russian information influence of Belarus. Could you expand a bit on that?
Поясните, пожалуйста, не расслышал.
Can you please repeat? Can you please repeat your question, please?
Дело в том, что вот в последние годы и месяцы российское влияние осуществляется все более активно с применением.
Lately, the Russian influence is being exerted with the help of latest information technologies, mainly manipulative. First of all, efforts are taken to discredit the Republic of Belarus as a sovereign European state, as a part of the major Russian world. And also new information resources have been created which are not controlled by the Belarusian authorities and have unidentified sources of funding. And such resources have a clear Belarusian orientation. And it was lately it was noted that the number of internet resources, internet media that share and spread disinformation and propaganda and hate speech against Belarus has increased up to 40 times. following the beginning of the protests that started in autumn of 2020, the Belarusian authorities blocked the most important Belarusian resources, and the population of the country is now subjected to the information spread by other sources. My question is whether the regime of Lukashenko realized the danger of Russia's almost uncontrolled information influence on the population of Belarus. Yes, they quite well realize that, but they don't admit that. And eventually, should the interests of Putin and Lukashenko diverge, they will have to defend their citizens against their closest ally. If you ask a question about any preventive measures being taken, I would like to say that currently they react only point by point. In April 2020, 2 employees of the Russian First Channel were denied accreditation, and on the basis that this case was connected to the death of a person whose apartment was illegally taken over. The paradox of this system is that Belarus is regularly taking the Russian sources of information, and but international community, European mechanisms to counter dissemination of false information cannot be really used because Belarus is not taking part in relevant international agreements. Belarus and Russia remain strategic allies. However, Lukashenko has basically suppressed all the alternative forces and actors. At the beginning of our webinar today, Daria mentioned that to oppose the threats of foreign influence, we should strengthen democratic institutes and promote a democratic agenda. However, Lukashenko and his regime, they are incapable of anything else but banning everything, and that they are such prohibitive measures will be actually blocked by the Russian media by appealing to the principles of democracy and freedom of speech. Any attempts of the citizens of Belarus to consolidate efforts and to repel the information aggression from the outside will simply be suppressed by sophisticated manipulative machinery of Russia. Basically, we can talk about the confrontation of 2 propaganda machines, Belarusian and Russian. And of course, the information security, in the opinion of Lukashenko and Lukashenko's regime, is equal to national security, to be taken under control of the law enforcers and not by media or citizens. Basically, this regime has separated itself from the society, in this way having become more vulnerable in the face of a stronger regime. As a result, we experience the decreasing level of trust of citizens in any information. We have seen reports that it is due to the authoritarian leadership of Lukashenko Belarus is becoming more vulnerable to any attacks from the outside, including those with the use of hybrid warfare. Those are the main points I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Melnikau. We will now take questions to our panelists. If you do have a question, please type those in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And while you are typing things in, I will start by reading out some questions that have come in already. The first question is aimed at David Levine. You talked about Russian influence in several of the larger West European countries. What about the smaller ones, such as Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands? Would you say that the situation is different there?
It's an excellent question. I should first add that I'm not as well versed in all of those regions as I am in the others, but we'll take Netherlands because I think it's an illustration of why this question is important. When we think about Russian intervention in other democratic countries, a number of things are sort of important to consider when they're trying to intervene. Number one, are they significant trading partners, I think there's been a lot of research that's looked at the calculus of that and what impact that might have had, for example, when the Netherlands had their 2017 elections, where there appeared to be a little less, or maybe potentially less intervention in Netherlands elections than expected. I think another piece of this, of course, is the response ahead of time by democratic countries, And of course, Dutch officials made very clear in that election, as well as in their more recent election this year, that there would be strong resistance and an interference campaign could lead to severe consequences, Something that we have not seen from democratic countries uniformly across the transatlantic community. And then I think there are also some other interesting questions around, capabilities. We know, for example, we've heard some conversation around the United States. We know that they had the ability, Russia did in the Kremlin, to mount significant disinformation campaigns with regards to English. I'd be interested if the other panelists have more insights than I do on this. I'm not quite sure about the capabilities that existed there, for example, for Russian troll farms to do it in Dutch. And so, when we look at these other countries, I think it's worth, you have to keep in mind, what economic relationships might exist, what capabilities may exist with regards to the Kremlin, and what actions, those countries, including the ones that were asked about, have been taken to potentially deter Russia from trying to interfere in elections.
Thank you very much, David. I have two questions that have been raised for Olga. The first one is, well, quite simply, does the Russian government want to see an end to NATO? And if so, why? The second question is, we have seen several Central European countries turning to more authoritarian processes in recent years. Well, Hungary and Poland are often cited as examples. Would you see the Russian government as being involved in this in some way? And what is their relationship between these governments and the Putin's government?
All right. So for the first question, NATO has, been one of Russia's. Well, they say they are one of the biggest threats to Russia, for decades. Despite there being zero evidence, Russia is the one who has invaded their neighbors. They run, influence operations on their neighbors and in Europe. But so recently, NATO is back in the news between Russia because they decided to suspend their membership with NATO. And this all started because Russia's, 8 spies were caught inside of NATO. So yes, they do want to see an end to NATO. That is one of the reasons they run these operations, because they basically not only NATO, but all alliances. They want, again, to sow as much chaos that they can, whether it's within NATO, European Parliament, US and Europe relations, and anything that they could do. As far as for the second question, we have seen, what's happening in Hungary. It's unbelievable because they've taken a very authoritarian turn in the middle of Europe. Europe is a democracy, and here you have Orban, who is basically an autocrat in the heart of Europe, along with Lukashenko. So Russia's influence is definitely there. They have a very long relationship, at least going back over a decade, with Orban. And they, again, play on the, in this case, they play on the far right side, where they use the sentiments of the nationalists to, gain influence inside into the politics. And as a result, they, from Hungary and with Poland, well, not as much Poland, but with Hungary, when Europe needs to have an appropriate response to an attack that has occurred on European soil or interference in election, you have a leader like Orban who will be a roadblock to it. And they kind of, even we saw this with Belarus recently, when Lukashenko hijacked a plane over Belarus airspace, and the EU, had a response. By the time the actual response came, it was watered down because of leaders like Orban, who are very closely associated, with the Kremlin.
Thank you very much, Olga. Another question that's come in, and I want to address that to Nika, Aleksejeva, given your research. It's about deep fakes. Can we expect the Russian government to use deepfake tools and technology in their aim to manipulate audiences in Europe?
Yes, we can expect that, as this technology exists, and the worry is that it will be used in such way. Nevertheless, recently there was a case in Latvia, but also in other European parliaments and international organizations, where two Russian pranksters pretended to be Leonid Volkov. And these pranksters managed to arrange online conference calls with parliamentarians and representatives of these NGOs to later publish some extracts from these conversations on their YouTube channel. And when the story broke in Latvia, it was partially due to the reason that Latvian public broadcaster also accidentally used the fake Leonid Volkov as a source to allege that the new Navalny will be Yuri Dud, which is quite funny for Russians, but some may think that everything is possible in so changing world. And when it broke out, because the initial meeting with parliamentarians was not public, the parliamentarian who wrote about it on Facebook put two images side by side and showed how similar this fake Volkov looked to the real Volkov. And the first claim was that it was deep fake. They looked so similar, therefore it must be technologically created image. Nevertheless, technology is quite resourceful. You need to have someone who can code or use this deep machine learning technique to generate such image. You also need to have a powerful computer who could basically alter the words and use this false face while you are live. It requires quite high technological capabilities in sense of powerful technology and also person who can run it. Therefore, it wasn't disregarded as possibility, and later it turned out that just makeup was used. And in case with Latvia, the person didn't even turn the camera on. So the notion of deepfakes can also be weaponized in such a way that we think that it's a deepfake. We know that it's hard to produce, especially in good quality. Therefore, we think that, oh, Russia is capable of it. Therefore, it's far ahead of us with all the technology advancements. While in fact, it was just playing with people, playing with their psychology, jumping to conclusions before we have enough evidence.
Thank you very much for that. One question to Professor Melnikau, if you could give us a brief answer to this hypothetical question. If things change in Belarus and a more European-focused government takes over, how do you think that the Russian government would respond?
Я боюсь, что я вас разочарую, даже, возможно,
I'm afraid that I am going to disappoint you or shock you. Better be pessimist, hoping for the better still. I think pro-Russian lobby that is going to shape up any political agenda, pretending, claiming they are holding free and fair election, but nevertheless they will institute the president that is loyal to Russia. I remember when Lukashenko was instituted as the president loyal to Russia, with the loyalty of Belarusian citizens to the Russian propaganda. The people who went to protest on in the streets in 2020 is about 1 million people. In Belarus, the population is over 9 million people, and 2 million are children. And where are the remaining 6 to 7 million? They are the people that are so susceptible to the Russian propaganda. How can the pro-European government come to lead Belarus? I don't see any preconditions for it. The situation is quite vulnerable and pessimistic. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor Melnikau. Well, we have come to the end of our time together. I wish to thank all our panelists. I want to thank all of you for participating. I wish to again thank USAID for supporting this event, our excellent interpreters, and my IFES colleagues for preparing and managing this event. So the next discussion will take place on November the 30th, that's a Tuesday, and it will focus on disinformation in politics and in elections, and including the issue of how efforts to counteract disinformation may reduce free speech and limit civil society space. So I hope to see you all then, and until then, stay safe.